I'll say it again, being anti-racist is good. It's principled. I'm anti-racist. But what we've in fact seen from many of the left is not anti-racism, but a new racism. It's aimed at whites. It's like they're really cheering for a clash of races sometimes, and that is playing with deadly fire. Now, of course, there are white racists. Tragically, they include this nutter who on Saturday walked into a supermarket in New York State in a predominantly black area and murdered 10 people. President Joe Biden emphasised the undoubted racism of the killer. And in London, writing the day before this massacre, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, wrote that the West's battle against the far right, he means the white right, is going to define this century. Brendan, your Lord Mayor in London says the West's battle against the far right will define this century. Is he right?
I don't think so. And the thing that worries me about when Sadiq Khan and others say things like that is that they have such a flexible definition of what it means to be far right. And lots of the time they're just talking about people who vote for UKIP or other parties on the right, or they're talking about populists, or they're talking about the whole idea of Brexit. These are the kinds of things that they fold into the banner of far right. So I'm worried that they're actually going to declare war on perfectly legitimate points of view, not just things that we all agree are terrible, the people on the extreme fringes of hard right politics. But the thing I think we should be tackling right now is identity politics, because identity politics, and this massacre in Buffalo, New York, is another example of it, has unleashed a new round of racial paranoia. It really ratchets up the politics of victimhood, racial animus, division, tension. We're supposed to judge everyone now by their skin color, by what they look like. And I really think these kinds of horrific, violent attacks are an expression of that racial paranoia unleashed by this new politics. And that's what we need to start talking about.
The biggest protest movement in a generation was Black Lives Matter. It really took off 2 years ago after the killing of George Floyd and spread around the world, to Australia too, and donations flooded in, more than $100 million just in 2020. And one of the Marxist founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, described that torrent of cash just last week.
That was a lot of white guilt money.
But where did all that white guilt money actually go? Well, a chunk seems to have gone on buying houses, like this $8 million mansion which Cullors has used for parties. And she's also reportedly bought herself a third or fourth house. But there's no evidence, of course, that she used Black Lives Matter money for that. We don't know. But that is not to say that she and her family did not benefit from that cash, according to the Black Lives Matter tax filings, which have now been publicised. Joining me is Sky News US correspondent Annalise Nielsen. Annalise, good to catch up again. What do these tax filings tell us?
These tax filings reveal just an extraordinary amount about what's been going on with Black Lives Matter. Now, this is a really complicated idea, especially overseas, because we're all so familiar with the BLM movement. We've seen the signs, we've seen people wear the T-shirts and the face masks, and a lot of people don't realise there's an actual charity behind that that's existed since 2013, even if they only really took off in a significant financial way after the murder of George Floyd. And this is where there's been so much shock about where all this money was going from. But going to, I should say, there was evidence from this tax filing that it was going to relatives of this Patrisse, and it was being used in that capacity, and this is where it's really degrading the trust. But
Greg, there's a very interesting comment overnight from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, he invaded Ukraine in February with the excuse that, well, here's Ukraine as wanting to join NATO, the European and American Defence Alliance, which would put the NATO right on Russia's border. This was terrible. His invasion since, though, has now scared neutral Finland and Sweden, both on Russia's doorstep, into saying they want to join NATO too. Russia was initially warning of war if they did this, but Putin has now said, as far as expansion goes, including new members, Finland and Sweden, to NATO, Russia has no problems with these states, none. And so in this sense, there's no immediate threat to Russia from an expansion. What does this amazing back down tell you?
Well, I think it tells us that Putin is much weaker than he was 6 months ago, and he has produced everything he didn't want out of his invasion of Ukraine. I mean, states do sometimes do incredibly dumb things, like Cambodia provoking a war with Vietnam, which was 10 times as big as it. He said he invaded Ukraine because he was so affronted by NATO expansion, and now he's produced an expansion which was on no one's radar previously, Finland and Sweden wanting to join, although they may be held up by Turkey, which is a de facto Putin ally, and it shows in a sense how anomalous Turkey's position inside NATO is.
Now, listen, overseas students have been a massive business for Australia, particularly students from China. I mean, just the uni fees alone are worth $12 billion a year to us. That's massive. Don't even include all the living costs. Now, the pandemic obviously put a big hole in that, but universities now thinking, well, don't worry, the students are going to come back any moment now. But so far, only a third of the 150,000 international students we'd be getting by each February, most Chinese, have come back. And there seems to be a big change in China, that it's not just the threat to our universities, probably to the world. The dictatorship seems determined to make China more like North Korea, to some extent, to cut it off. I'll show you the pattern. In 2014, China banned even Google Scholar, which academics use to catch up with research around the world. 2 years ago, it banned foreign textbooks from most schools. Then Shanghai, its biggest city, banned English exams in primary schools. Last month, private English schools were banned. Now the president has told universities not to copy foreign universities, and already some have said, OK, we're going to withdraw from overseas university rankings because Chinese universities have standards of all their own. And now exams for students wanting to study overseas have been banned, allegedly because of the pandemic. Last year, Sri Lanka's president said that he too wanted to transition away from fossil fuels. And boy, has he just got his wish good and hard. Because he also had another bright green dream, and this is the real problem, to go organic. To stop all farmers in Sri Lanka from using synthetic fertilisers, the kind that actually needs lots of fossil fuels to make. And last April, they were banned in Sri Lanka, along with pesticides. And Sri Lanka's 2 million farmers were made to go organic instead, for the good of the planet, the idiot president said.
We are to preserve the health of our planet and ensure human sustainability. Governments the world over must not hesitate to adopt bold.
That turned out to be a colossal mistake, and the poor are paying the highest price. Sri Lanka's rice production fell 20% in just 6 months. Sri Lanka went from exporting rice to importing $500 million worth just to feed its people. Production of tea, Sri Lanka's biggest export, also crashed, costing another $500 million. Fertilisers, you see, they work. Who knew? And not using them will cost you big time. Add to that the virus pandemic. Sri Lanka's tourism, of course, got smashed, plus corruption and mismanagement and crippling loans to China, and Sri Lanka's economy is now devastated. Almost all its foreign reserves are gone, leaving the government struggling to find the money to pay for vital imports. There are shortages of food and of medicines. There have been protests by angry farmers and violence with supporters of the president and his family beating protesters in the street. People have been killed. And the president has sure got his wish with fossil fuel. His Prime Minister today said the country's just got 1 day's supply of petrol left, and not much gas either. People are desperate now, with gas prices almost tripling over the year.
We need the gas. Only gas.
We want gas, gas. We want gas, gas.
I am a mother. One child I have. I can't give anything to ask my child.
Australia also faces a crisis with fertiliser. Now, we just aren't a mining country. We are also a farming one. And our weakness in that is that we don't actually make much of our own fertiliser. We import most of it from overseas, more than $3 billion a year. For instance, 2/3 of our phosphate rock comes from China alone. Its foot on our throat. And with China's export bans, because China and Russia, the two biggest suppliers, exporters of fertiliser to the world, both countries have banned or severely limited exports. And now there's a worldwide shortage of fertiliser, prices have soared, and there are now reports warning that Australia's wheat harvest alone could drop by 20% over the next year, in part because farmers just can't afford the fertiliser. And that's just Australia. Imagine the real hunger now facing the third world. This is the warning now. We could be back to starvation in some countries if we don't get this sort of thing fixed, these supply lines for fertiliser. Joining me is someone who's warned about our particular vulnerability for years, National Senator Matt Canavan, the former Resources Minister. Matt Canavan, thank you so much for your time. How serious is this problem?
Well, it's not just me saying this now, Andrew. It's the US President only a few weeks ago said food shortages will be real. The Bank of England Governor today said there'd be massive global food shortages in the months to come. And this is all a consequence of the crazy, green, insane policies that various Western countries primarily have adopted in the past few years. You've wonderfully highlighted the example of Sri Lanka, which is a microcosm there, and the issues that arose in Sri Lanka were local ones. But Western countries have fallen into the same sort of traps here by closing down their production of energy, of fossil fuels. And I mean, do you know, you probably see a lot of these student protesters on our streets about climate change, and they often hold up placards saying you can't eat coal or you can't eat gas. And it just beggars belief of me that young kids in this country aren't taught how food is actually grown. About half of the world's food comes from fertilisers that are made using primarily natural gas or some sort of fossil fuel. The carbon in those fossil fuels is extracted effectively to create a fertiliser. And so when you restrict the development of gas, of oil and coal, you will restrict the ability of the world to grow food.
What's the national unemployment rate?
National unemployment rate at the moment is, I think it's 5.4. Sorry, I'm not sure what it is.
What are the other 5 points, Mr. Albanese?
We will put people. It is all around the theme of
Mr.
putting people.
You are across your brief.
We will put people. We will put people at the centre of the NDIS.
Are these the 6 points here that had to be handed to you by your advisor?
You support the retention of temporary protection visas?
Yes.
Earlier on, I heard half the question and didn't hear all of it. We don't support temporary protection visas.
Borders are closed, Lisa. Our borders are closed. People are doing it tough. That's having an impact on employment figures. We know that that's the case.
How bad was Anthony Albanese's slip today, saying that the borders were closed and that explains why unemployment is so low? If we put TV clips of all these stumbles together, as I've just done just before you came on, you would assume that this is a guy that's simply not on top of his brief. Is that picture fair?
Well, I think to some extent maybe it is, but he might also just freeze under the spotlight. I mean, the bizarre thing about it was he went fine at the National Press Club yesterday, that sort of forum. He goes well in the Parliament. He's a good parliamentary performer. Not that anyone watches that, although a few do, thankfully, for Sky News' sake. But when it comes to that press conference environment, geez, he or that particular interview, not good at all. And I think it's a reflection if Labor does win this election. I said earlier this afternoon, it's like the Anastasia Palaszczuk-Campbell-Newman contest. In that Queensland state election contest, 3 days before polling day, Anastasia Palaszczuk couldn't name the GST rate. There was a front page in the Courier Mail. I thought she's gone. When Anthony Albanese stuffed up on the unemployment rate in this campaign, when I asked him, I thought he was gone. Not the case. Sometimes people don't need a convincing opponent. They just want to not see the incumbent again. And that's the danger for Scott Morrison here, that any distrust around Albanese about his ability to remember details or facts when he has to is overtaken by ill feeling towards Scott Morrison. And that, of course, relates to the vaccine rollout, its pace, his handling of the fires, him being slow on floods funding, all that sort of theme. And him being on TV for 3 years, really, no one lasts that long in these jobs, it seems.
Let's look first at Labor frontbencher KRISTINA KENEALLY, who's running in this election in the multicultural and working class seat of Fowler, 44 kilometres from her luxury home on Scotland Island. Now, she's prayed in this new electorate of hers like a good Catholic in a local church, and she's met local Catholic priests and nuns to tell them how good she is. And yet one of her campaign officials, listed as her primary contact in one of Keneally's social media posts, has photographed himself in the Catholic bishop's mitre and with a crucifix, clearly mocking the Catholic Church that Keneally's campaign is trying so hard to woo. Now, the Labor official here has also had a personal site on Fansly offering pictures of himself to fans, but that's his business. I won't show you those pictures. But I wonder how sincere Keneally's pitch to socially conservative Catholics in Fowler really is, or her pitch to Muslim leaders there, for that matter, this mocking of her church. Now, we asked Keneally's office for comment. Wouldn't trust us with an answer. We approached Labor headquarters, which told us the staffer, who'd earlier worked for former Labor leader Bill Shorten, was just a volunteer who worked in Keneally's campaign office for a couple of hours, now and then, just a junior member, no biggie. Yet, he posts agendas for meetings using Keneally's letterhead. He coordinates Teams chats on WhatsApp group chats and is listed by Keneally as a contact. He's even got a Parliament House email address, which is given to staffers, not volunteers. Now, the man himself, we haven't heard from, but the husband of KRISTINA KENEALLY's main rival in Fowler, Lee, an independent, managed to confront him over Keneally's misleading campaign posters, falsely painting Lee as a Liberal.
You know, you're KRISTINA's chief of staff. You know, this is not the Liberal candidate. You got that wrong. So there's a lot of lies going on here. Very interesting. Yeah, that's my wife. She's the independent. You guys even can't tell the locals apart. But when you're from the eastern suburbs, I suppose breathing our air, it's a bit difficult. Shouldn't you be ashamed of yourself to get it so wrong? Do I look ashamed?
It's this case against Scott Morrison, a real case where Labor would be better. It's got so insane, you know, that the Green Left commentators are now seizing the most idiotic criticisms instead. I mean, like shock, you know, this bulldozer of a man knocked over a poor innocent boy in a stunt playing soccer in Tasmania. A boy not hurt at all, by the way, because see how Morrison protected him. But ABC presenter Patricia Karvelis this morning snapped at a minister who thought all's well that ends well.
Well, crash tackled by the Prime Minister, that'll be a story you'll tell for the rest of your life, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, but he could have broken a bone, right?
Oh, it could have had a bone broken. Well, the boy and his mum, though, didn't seem in the least bothered.
You good? You all good?
Daisy Cousins, how could an ABC presenter look at all that incident, the boy high-fiving and happy and time of his life, and still look for a reason to attack Scott Morrison, who showed him so protective and, solicitous and trying to make sure he was all right? How could you look for a reason to still attack him?
God, you just have to be such a terrible sport, Andrew. I mean, that's really the only reason I can think of. Even if you don't like Scott Morrison, even if you don't want the Liberals to win, you just have to be a really terrible sport to look at that incident in which nobody was hurt, in which Scott Morrison very skillfully and with great agility made every effort to protect the child, to make sure there was no body weight. There was a high five. It was on soft grass, a really quite sweet little incident that maybe we could come together over, but no, he could have broken a bone. Oh my God. Just absolute terrible sportsmanship is really all I can say there.